Sceptre Radio Network. Internet radio uncensored, unconstrained, and unleashed. Where sometimes the questions are more dangerous than the answers.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the show. Tonight's edition of Disclosure Radio is quite special, actually. Tonight we have two special guests. Many of you are familiar with Nigel Kerner, who spoke on Sceptre Radio Network not too long ago with regards to his wonderful book, and The Great Aliens and the Harvesting of Souls, which I would hope that many of the listeners have purchased to help support Nigel and his research. The bio on Nigel is actually quite extensive, so I'm going to paraphrase the best that I can. You know that Nigel is both an author and a freelance journalist. He was born in Sri Lanka. His mother from a British planting family, and his father an officer in the British Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm. Nigel is an amazing researcher and has put together, which is probably one of the strongest compilations of facts and research based on the great alien phenomena in human origins as opposed to gray alien origins. I would say it's a combination of both. So we're really excited to have Nigel back with us on Sceptre Radio Network tonight. Our new guest is Dr. Andrew Silverman. He is a medical doctor with a background in physiology and has been interested from an early age in the nature of what we are as human beings and what our potential is. He has always been fascinated to know how the image on the Turin shroud could have formed, being mindful of the fact that it cannot be replicated even with 21st century technology. So I'm very excited to have Dr. Andrew Silverman, who has given me permission to refer to him as Andrew this evening, and Nigel Kerner. So Nigel, Andrew, welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Wonderful to be with you, Anthony.
Yeah, very pleased to be here.
Yeah, so I want to start off by letting the audience know that the focus of tonight's show is the Shroud of Turin, or Turin Shroud. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the Shroud of Turin because of the peculiar aspects behind the properties of the shroud itself. I have seen various documentaries on forensics analysis that have been performed on the shroud showing that under optical image analysis, there's a very strange effect that is, visible. It's almost like a 3D effect of what is assumed to be. Mind you, I'm not the expert, so I would assume that it's the blood of Christ, what we're seeing.
Well, you see, the thing is, there are bloodstains on the shroud which have been shown to be human blood. The blood itself doesn't have three-dimensional properties. The blood is simply the bloodstains are formed on the shroud by a simple contact process from which it can be deduced that the shroud once wrapped the three-dimensional body of a man who had been tortured, whipped. He'd had a cap of sharp objects placed upon his head. He'd been pierced through the wrists and through the hands and crucified. And incidentally, if you look at any medieval art, you'll see crucifixion depicted as with nails through the hands, which only within the past 100 or so years has it been known that actually the hands wouldn't be able to support the weight of the body. There were some experiments that were done by a forensic person around the turn of the 20th century that showed that they wouldn't actually take the weight of a body, but that the wrists would. And on the shroud, you see that this is where the blood is coming from the wrists and also from the feet. This is someone who had been whipped many times, over 120 flagellation marks on the body, and there's forensically the anatomical and pathological information that's on there has led many forensic pathologists to say that they have no doubt at all that this once wrapped the body of a dead man who had been tortured and crucified. And we know that he was dead when the shroud wrapped him, because otherwise it would have been covered in blood, you see, because the bleeding only stopped because of the death of the man that was later wrapped in the shroud.
Interesting. So, with regards to the markings on the cloth itself, from a non-academic's perspective, where I'm looking at it, from the layman's perspective, essentially, what I take away is that, from having watched documentaries and done a little bit of study, I'm able to walk away with the understanding that there was no piercing through the palms as typically understood. It was actually through the wrist, as you mentioned, to actually support the body. Correct? And
correct.
In which case, the shroud shows what would be technically the correct method of crucifixion, as which was also understood by many historians as to how the Romans performed crucifixion. It was never through the palm, it was through the wrist, correct?
Well, there weren't many detailed records of how the Romans performed crucifixion. But later, after those experiments were done, later in the 20th century, some archaeologists found some remains of somebody, a skeleton of somebody who had been crucified, that confirmed that it was actually through the wrists and the feet. But you see, also, if there were a nail piercing the wrist, it would go through something called the median nerve, which the stimulation of which would cause the thumb to turn in upon the palm. And in fact, you see, if you look at the image on the shroud, that the thumbs aren't visible, because they are behind the hand, as you would expect. Now, the thing is, this takes us to the other point, of course, that there are bloodstains on the shroud. There's also, the most fascinating thing of all is of what appears at first glance to be a very faint sepia image of a man on there as well. And until towards the end of the 19th century, 1898 it was, people thought this was just a faint image of a man that looked like a man who had been crucified based upon the bloodstains. Then, of course, with the development of photography, there was somebody called Secondopia who was given permission to take a photograph of the shroud. And the story goes that when he saw the plate for his photographic negative, he nearly dropped it in shock, because when you look at a photographic negative of the image on the Turin shroud, what you see is a well-resolved, positive image of the man, and nobody had seen this image for 20 centuries, and he was really surprised to find that, and at first nobody would believe him. They thought that this was some kind of hoax that he had done with his photography, until the shroud was again exhibited about 30 years later, and other photographers took pictures and realized that it's true, and you can still do it today, that the image on the shroud is a photographic negative, and it's only on the surface fibrils of the cloth. It's been shown to be about 1/5000th of a millimeter in thickness.
Wow.
Which is less than a human hair, and doesn't consist of any paint or anything that's been added to the surface of the cloth, but instead it's a kind of aging of the superficial fibrils, which is the little bits that go to make the fibers. And it's very similar to what happens if paper is left out in sunlight, how it turns into a slightly sepia color from the ultraviolet light, causing what chemists know as oxidation and dehydration.
Absolutely.
And this is what appears to have happened somehow to the shroud, and we can perhaps talk a bit more about that.
Sure. For those listening, Secondopia was an Italian lawyer and amateur photographer, and of course he's best known for taking the first photographs of the Shroud of Turin, and this was on May 28th, 1898. And as the good doctor just mentioned, the image that he obtained from the shroud had been approved. It shows what is believed to be, the negative shows to be, the image of the Holy, Christ, Jesus Christ. And this image, it was approved by the Roman Catholic Church as part of the devotion to the Holy Face of Jesus. Is that correct?
Well, the thing is, from my point of view, I don't see the shroud from as a religious icon, so to speak.
Sure.
I see it as something that I would like to try to understand rationally and from the evidence. I actually come from a Jewish background, as it happens.
So so it's more of a scientific phenomena for you.
Well, it goes beyond that. I'll explain. I mean, the thing is that the image on the shroud is there and can be scientifically analyzed and interpreted and so on. Mm-hmm. And for me, there are some people who will say you can never explain it, it's a mystery, it's a miracle and so on. But this is a physical object that we can physically study.
Wonderful.
And so I would like to as much as I can try to understand it rationally.
Sure.
Now, it seems to me that to do that, we need to actually perhaps extend the borders of what is normally considered to be science, and wonder, is it just merely a coincidence that all of the forensic and historical and pollen and so on evidence that points to the identity of the evidence that's consistent with the identity of the man who the shroud wrapped as being the historical Jesus of Nazareth? Mm-hmm. And is this just coincidence that he's the one person in history that formed this image for that something like this happened to? Or could this be a clue that might actually help us extend our understanding both of the physical world and of the nature of humanity and what human potential is, that he was perhaps demonstrating an example of? Because just to say, it's magic or it's miracle, mm-hmm. It's a mystery, God did it. It's just sort of passing off the question and I don't see how that's going to lead to any real deeper understanding, because how do you take that further?
Sure.
Yeah, can I just come in here?
Absolutely.
I take another view on this, Anthony, and that is, you don't really have to eat a cow patch to know that it's excrement, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
If I can put it that way. Mm-hmm. And I think you can stretch what Andrew is saying far too far before you say, look, there is a huge controversy about this particular individual, and here is evidence that bears incredible correlations to the entire format on which this individual we call Jesus Christ actually comes to the world. Now, there are going to be millions of people who will look at it this way, and I think that sometimes the strictures of science actually weaken the scientific argument, and I come at it from that perspective. Now, in my case, whilst I appreciate what Andrew says about this and the way Andrew wants to work at it, that's his business. My point is that when one looks at the significance of what this might be in terms of the human condition, that is a far grander and more wonderful aspect to what the shroud might be. And so I come at this through that correlation, you see.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask the both of you. In 1978, there was ultraviolet photographs that were taken of the shroud. Now, that, much in the way that Secondo Pia's, initial negative of the image of the shroud, turned everything upside down and really caused a lot of controversy. What from your guys' perspective, in 1978, when the ultraviolet photographs were taken, did that elevate all of this to the next level? And if it did, what was the significance?
Well, you see, Anthony, the thing is that actually even before 1978, one of the people who was instrumental in leading the STURP, Shroud of Turin Research Project group, Dr. John Jackson, had already made a discovery using some technology that was developed for NASA. Which is something called an image intensifier, VP8. And you see, what happens is that if you put an ordinary photograph in this image intensifier, then what it does is it translates the intensity of the image into distance coding. And what you get with an ordinary photograph is a random set of peaks and troughs. Now, what Dr. Jackson noticed is that when you put an image of the shroud in this VP8 analyzer, instead of seeing that random set of peaks and troughs, what you see is a three-dimensional relief coming out at you of the body that the shroud wrapped.
Wow.
Now, what this was in a way a sort of second eureka moment in shroud studies, shroud science, that following from what Secondo Pia had discovered about the photographic negative properties, which demonstrated that it's as though the image on the shroud has a distance coding in it that would translates to the intensity of the image on the shroud in relation to the distance that the cloth would have been from a body if there were a body wrapped in the shroud at the time that the image formed. So, see, taking the two things together, the three things together, the fact that that the image is only on the superficial fibrils, the fact that it's a photographic negative, and the fact that there's distance coding, led Dr. Jackson to postulate the idea that perhaps the image might have formed from a short, intense burst of radiant energy that came from the dead body of the man that the shroud wrapped. Now, you see, this is what I was trying to get at.
Sure.
If such a thing is possible, and we wish to try to understand this rationally, how such a thing could be without invoking miracle, mystery, magic, etc., then, and if it's not just a coincidence that the one time this happened was this unique individual who had such an impact on the world through what he taught and how he lived, that maybe these things are connected. Maybe this is a clue that might actually lead us to an understanding of the relationship between mind and matter, and an understanding, as I say, of the nature, the true nature of the physical world and where it comes from, and what a human being is. After all, it was a human being that was in the shroud.
Absolutely.
And that formed the image.
Okay, so let's say we strip away the entire religious argument. Let's put religion aside, and let's look at it purely from a scientific and historical phenomena based on the evidence, which is the shroud itself.
Yeah, Anthony, but can I just pause there a moment?
Sure.
Now, the whole business about religion and religious philosophy we're talking about is, as you say, beside the point, where this particular thing might be manifest in terms of the understanding that we can bring to it in present-day outlooks and so on. Mm-hmm. But the important thing to understand is that here is a controversy that is marked with so many people talking about, these relics from the past. There were so many lies said about the true cross, for instance. You could have a forest full of trees, never mind the actual mechanism that was used to kill this particular individual. And of course, there's been a great controversy whether he actually existed or not. So my point of view is simply this. If you've got so much correlations coming with that particular individual, then it's slightly pretentious to go on the purely scientific argument and say, look, this is not the way I look at it. I say, look, I'm coming at this, so there must be something about the nature of man that actually points to this. The point about it is that the nature of that man is at question, and that particular man in terms of a controversy. So I'm looking at it from that point of view. What made this particular man so incredible that this particular thing has happened, and we can't find any evidence with any other man of any such evidence.
So
that's the uniqueness of this Jesus Christ character.
Sure,
and that's what I'm trying to say.
Got it. So Nigel, you're saying that from an academic and historical standpoint, there is no evidence that replicates the phenomena that we see with the Shroud of Turin.
Absolutely. None at all. With anyone else. There are lots of claims, but there is no evidence.
Wonderful. Okay. So let's talk about the radiocarbon dating. There was a controversy because the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology had concluded that the independent analysis that had taken place at both the University of Oxford and the University of Arizona, the results were, showing that the shroud itself, the shroud material dated to about 1260 AD, somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. Now, it was later. There was a hypothesis which had risen much later that could have been attributed to a fire that had taken place at I believe it was a castle in France where it had been located.
Well, you see, the thing is, Anthony, that I was a student at the time that studying science as part of my medical degree. At the time that radiocarbon analysis was published in the journal Nature. Mm-hmm. And I used to read it regularly, so I actually saw it as it came out. And I remember noticing back then, I think it was February '89, that if you actually look at the figures that are in the little box, box of statistics that are there, some of the data from these laboratories, then you see that their own figures, based on their own quoted error ranges, suggest to any statistician or scientist that if you compare the datings made by the three different laboratories, they were dating three different objects. Now, the thing is, you see, you said that they, or it's commonly said that they dated the shroud material as being of the age 1260 to 1390, but it seems there's a lot of evidence that what they were dating was partly shroud material, but mixed with something that came later. This isn't so much to do with the fire. Remember, it was the original protocol for the carbon dating was that they were supposed to take 7 different samples from different parts of the cloth to be dated by 2 different radiocarbon methods. Now, actually, as it happened, they only took one sample from one corner of the cloth where it had been partly one of the areas where it had been most damaged, and you can see in lots of pictures of the shroud from its history that there's the corners where it was picked up and held when it was displayed, and frayed at the edges and so on, and bits cut off by relic hunters and so on to sell them and so on. And there was a couple in the States called Sue Benford and Joe Marino, who actually they were looking at some pictures of the shroud, and they noticed that there was something that didn't quite sit right. That it looked as though the area where the carbon dating sample was taken from looked different to the rest of the cloth. And they looked into this, and they found that there was a technique used by the nuns in France, and it's still used to this day, called invisible reweave, whereby if a cloth is damaged, you can weave new material into it, which in a way that preserves the original pattern of the cloth. And so they suggested this to one of the STURP team, actually, who was a chemist at that's the Shroud of Turin research project group, who went in '78 to Turin and for 5 days around the clock were analysing the shroud. So one of that team was Ray Rogers from Los Alamos Laboratory, a chemist. And he had, when he'd started, all the people, when they went to Turin, the STURP team, many of them went there, they were from all different walks of life, several religions, Jewish, Christian, agnostic, etc. And none of them really had a religious agenda about the shroud. Most of them assumed it was a piece of art from medieval times, and they were going to find the brushstrokes, they thought, in a few minutes, and then they'd go home, and they'd have had a free trip to Turin. And of course, they found nothing of the sort. Wow. Their conclusions were that there was no way that an artist could have done this. But because he was a good scientist, Ray Rogers, and when he heard that the carbon dating had said it was medieval, although he couldn't understand how a medieval forger could have done it, he said, "Okay, well, I thought it was authentic. I thought it was, at least it appeared to be something that couldn't be made by an artist, but it looks like it was medieval based on the carbon dating. And so he heard that Benford and Marino was saying this about the reweave, and he was angry. He said he called them these people from the lunatic fringe. I've got the material, he said, from near where the carbon dating was taken, and also from other parts of the cloth. I'm going to get these tested chemically and show that they're the same. And then, before he died, he was interviewed and by video, and he actually had a paper published in a peer-reviewed journal called Thermochemica Acta, where he demonstrated that actually, as he himself said it, he set out to prove them wrong, and he ended up proving them right. He found that the area where the carbon dating had been taken from was chemically completely distinct from the rest of the cloth. It had far more cotton in it, had been dyed, and so on to make it look the same as the rest of the cloth. And this explains why even within this tiny 7-centimeter strip of cloth that was divided between the 3 laboratories, you get such variance of the results, because they have different amounts of impurity from the cloth that was added in the 16th century during the reweave. And many of us have been lobbying to try and get the church to release more samples, perhaps from other parts that they have, that they have in reserve, without actually taking more samples from the cloth.
So essentially,
they won't allow it.
So it was a less than ideal sample for performing the carbon dating, is what Rogers was saying.
It's not just that it was a less than ideal sample. It broke the first rule of carbon dating, or any scientific analysis, is that if you want to analyze an object and you want to take a sample, that sample you take from the object has to be representative of that object. You can't take a piece of an apple to understand what an orange is. So if you're taking a piece of the cloth, which is actually not the large proportion of what you're taking wasn't part of the original cloth but was added later, then you can't get an accurate date of the original cloth from that sample.
Interesting.
Basically.
Okay. All right.
Of course,
go ahead, Nigel.
Of course, it may have been that it was an honest mistake.
Oh,
but
yeah.
In fact, that they actually did this, and the intentions were good, but they actually were sloppy about this and just took a part of the cloth that actually had this cotton weave through it, and so on. And we're not suggesting there was any collusion or any kind of, nefarious action there.
That's right. I agree with Nigel, yeah.
Yeah. And so the point is that if you're looking at, as Andrew says, if you're looking at something as priceless and as significant as this, in terms of the dates, the simple procedure would have been, in order not to make those kinds of mistakes, let's look at this strictly, as he says again in scientific terms, as that which will give its full authority to the final results that come out, Sure. And that really wasn't done, Anthony. And this is the big deal in the Shroud. Is lots of people say, "Oh, look, it's a medieval thing. They said it. They did and they don't want to know." And there's usually some kind of religious bias behind all of this. But as you know,
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. Go ahead. Andrew. Rather, Anthony.
Yeah. If I may interject, you're absolutely right. There's whenever you discuss any religious relic, and you try and infuse a scientific or academic perspective, there's still a level of bias and a level of contradictory behaviors between various groups.
It has to be said both ways.
Sure.
The science people will do that, and the religious people will do that. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So we've got that saying that you've got that eternal kind of inbuilt prejudice of factionalization, and we'll always fight over this thing.
Okay, so
the thing is that, for example, there are many scientists who are actually, for example, I would describe Richard Dawkins as a man of faith. Mm-hmm. He has faith in his religion is scientism.
Sure.
Against whatever the evidence shows, he'll stick to his sort of dogmas.
On atheism, right? Yes.
For example, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, gentlemen, let's do this. Let's take a look at this Shroud of Turin from another perspective. Let's look at it from the perspective of the fabric itself and the fact that there have been, again, like we were just discussing, different ideas and different opinions on the genuineness of the shroud, emerging from the Jesus era, Middle East, for instance, or excuse me, Jerusalem. In 2000 there were fragments of a burial shroud from the 1st century that were discovered in a tomb near Jerusalem. These were believed to have belonged to a Jewish high priest or a member of the aristocracy. Now, the shroud was composed of a simple two-way weave, unlike the complex herringbone twill of the Shroud of Turin. Now, based on that discovery, there was new controversy because a biblical scholar by the name of Diana Fulbright, she took offense to the fact that various individuals were saying that the Shroud of Turin could not have been from Jesus-era Jerusalem, or at least originated from the Jesus-era Jerusalem, because of the fact that the herringbone twill was so unlike what they had found in the shroud that belonged to the Jewish high priest or a member of aristocracy. And it went further than that. There were further analysis performed by other people on this, and they who was that guy? I forget the guy's name, but there was somebody who had stated that the Shroud of Turin that it did not display weaving or sewing techniques that could show that it was a high quality product. So they were assuming that because it was Jesus, it had to have been a high quality product. Who's to say that the shroud itself, should come under that type of scrutiny based on what people believe, Jesus would have worn because of who he was? Don't you think that that's a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for, Nigel?
Okay. Yeah. Pretentious.
Pretentious.
Yeah. Well, Anthony, the point is quite simple. That particular shroud was not supposed to have been Christ's shroud, Jesus Christ's shroud. It was ascribed to a rather rich man there, a fellow called Joseph of Arimathea, and the record shows that he went and asked Pilate for the body.
Pontius
one
Pilate.
assumes, one assumes that a man of his eminence, and he was a very, very, he was acknowledged as a wealthy man and a very influential man in the Jewish hierarchy of the actual synagogue that on the condemnation of Christ took place in, and so on. So, in a sense, all of this is a red herring. Here is a piece of cloth that may well have been part of the death array of a very rich man. It was used in terms of, in my view, probably the most wondrously rich individual in the world in terms of spiritual tenets and expositions and so on. And so the real question, I think Andrew answered very well, and that is that this entire thing about the date being wrong is very suspicious and ought to be actually done again, because the controversies that are coming from it are also endorsed by other scientists, not just the ones that were involved in the controversy in the first instance at the time of the dating and so on.
Well, go ahead, Doctor.
Yeah, I was just going to say that actually one of the people who was involved in a junior capacity in the carbon dating in the time in the 1980s actually now runs one of those laboratories, and Professor Ramsey in Oxford. And he's gone on record, and people can check this out on his on the Oxford Radiocarbon website. He's gone on the record as saying that there's so much evidence that suggests to so many people that the shroud is much older than the radiocarbon dating suggests, so that we have to look at all the evidence to build up a consistent picture of the origins of what he calls this intriguing cloth. So he's still open to the possibility that although he thinks it's medieval, he's open to the possibility that it isn't, because there's so much other evidence that suggests that it's not. But it's much older than that.
An analysis of the dirt particles showed, now this was using high-resolution microprobing, showed that the dirt in the shroud was travertine aragonite limestone, which was consistent with the limestone that they found in some of the tombs in ancient Jerusalem. Now, did that lend more credence to the authenticity of the shroud, or when they coupled that with all of this supposition and arguing that emerged from the carbon dating, did they discount that analysis?
Well, there is some controversy about the basis of the aragonite data, but there's also lots of data based on, for example, pollen evidence. There's actually a Jewish professor of botany at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Professor Avinom Danin, who has done studies on the pollen of the shroud and so on. And basically, if you look at where the pollen comes from that's on the shroud, of course, you see pollen from Europe. We know that the shroud has been in Europe for the past few hundred years, but you also see some pollens from the Middle East, which actually, if you triangulate them together to look at the areas where these plants produce their pollen, then it intersects on a small area around Jerusalem, and he points out that these plants actually produce their pollen around March and April. So that places the shroud to have been exposed to the elements, the open air, in Jerusalem in March and April. Now we see on the shroud the forensic evidence of a Roman crucifixion, and also, we know from historical records that for most of the time that the Romans were crucifying the Jews in Judea, that they were leaving them out as examples, so to speak, for people to see, like in the sort of gory way that the Londoners used to do when they used to put heads on poles and so on. The Romans were the same. They used to leave the bodies there to rot and for the birds to peck at them and so on. Wow. And so, and we know from looking at the shroud that the body hasn't been decayed in that way by the time that the image formed. And we also know that there was a period between Common Era or AD, whatever we call it, 6 and 66, when there was a Jewish figurehead who had some power in Judea, and there was an agreement that with the Romans to try and keep the peace and stop too many rebellions from happening. That at least they weren't going to be able to stop the Romans from torturing and crucifying people, but they were at least going to allow them to have a traditional Jewish burial. And anyone who knows anything about a traditional Jewish burial will know that it has to be quick. It has to be soon after the death has happened. You don't leave the body out to the elements and so on. And this appears to be what's happened with the man of the shroud, that he had a quick burial. So that places the man of the shroud as someone who was tortured and crucified and had a cap of thorns on his head and was pierced in the side in Jerusalem in March or April, sometime between the years of 6 and 66.
Interesting.
Very quick.
Go ahead.
And had a very quick funeral. Had a very quick Jewish funeral kind of thing. That's a very important point to make. Just one thing, if I may say this, Anthony, and that is that another one of the bits of sensational evidence that the new science is turning up. The Italian Agency for New Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development, I quote, ENER, Now, these people, the scientists there, say that a short, intense burst of UV directional radiation is the explanation they have found to reproduce the uniqueness, the unique features on the image. And this degree of power, they say, and this is an incredible thing, degree of power cannot be reproduced by any normal UV source built to date. In fact, they discovered that it would have taken 34,000 billion watts to actually do this, make this effect happen. They also suggest that it is impossible that the shroud could be faked in this way. It's just impossible. That is the conclusion of atomic scientists today in Italy.
Yes, Dr. Di Lazzaro, when he was interviewed for a newspaper, I like the way he put it. He said that for an artist or for any kind of craftsman to have forged the image on the shroud, that would be a miracle, to be able to forge such a thing, because we don't know how to do it with 21st century technology. So you'd have to sort of invoke the idea of a miraculous forgery.
So we're looking at the product of some form of irradiation. It had to have been, based on what you're telling me.
Well, I mean, there are. Right. There are different schools of thought about how the image got there, but I would agree that the evidence does point towards radiation as being the cause of the image. The fact that the superficial nature of it, the photographic negative properties, the distance coding. To me, it's only a burst of radiant energy that would account for that. There are other ideas about how it got there, but to me, they don't really hold up, in my opinion.
Okay, so when we look at a lot of the religious texts, one moment, Nigel. Sorry, just before I lose my train of thought here, because I want, this is actually directed at you, Nigel. When we look at it, apocryphal text, we look at the writings of the Gnostics and or the Bible itself, and we look at the book of we look at the story of Ezekiel, and this is where it gets kind of controversial. There's this component, this off-world component. Is that ever discussed when with regards to the Shroud of Turin? Whereas, in the Book of Enoch and various other Gospels, you have these off-world components that a lot of your ancient aliens experts tend to make reference to. Has there been anyone who's made any type of reference to the Shroud of Turin as having this off-world phenomena attributed, especially because of the irradiation hypothesis and the fact that it's something that cannot be recreated by even technology today unless it were under a massive scale?
Yeah. There's one such nutcase that does that, and his name is called Nigel Kerner. And my argument actually goes like this. I believe that this object, and this, everyone has is entitled to have a take on all of this. And studying all the science, I also have a scientific background. Taking all the science, taking all the research that I've seen, listening to Andrew for days at an end, puffing on his cigar and pontificating about the shroud and its technical aegis and so on, I come to the conclusion, and I think I'm entitled to bring a little bit of the historical and analogues to bear on this. And whilst you cannot actually prove anything in terms of an empirical sense, if you see what I'm trying to say, there is so much to suggest that this extraordinary thing may have been down to an extraordinary personality. And of course, we then couple that to things coming, shall we say, extraordinarily into the picture, which might include aliens and all that kind of business. Sure. But my point is quite simply this, and this is my great interest, is actually equating it to all the kinds of, historical records, like the Gnostic texts and so forth, and all the other kind of evidential notation that one comes across, and that is quite simply this: if there is an extraterrestrial connection, my conclusion is simply this: that this wondrous effect they call the Shroud of Turin shows us the antithesis to any kind of extraterrestrial type of effect. And I'm now dealing particularly with what I call the Greys, this roboidal format that I believe is a menace to every living human being on the earth. And I think that it shows the power, Anthony, this is the incredible thing, it shows the power of our natural humanity against the artificial construct that these machine-type beings are, and that we are trying to make ourselves through the thing that is going to come quite soon, I believe, in our world, this absolute madness of a transposition of our natural state in a kind of transhumanistic kind of way, and the making of man into a machine. And that is something that I think forebodes a warning to all of us, just in case it is true. Now, I think it's worth speculating that if this wonderful being could do this, and there's a lot more that can be said about the Shroud in terms of the actual moment of what might have been the resurrection. And I like Andrew to talk about that if you would let him.
Absolutely.
Because that really does point some incredible features, to it. Yes, there is a very strong correlation. I've done all the research, I've written it in the book and so on, and people can actually see that. But I think people should actually listen to Andrew's take and Andrew's delivery, if you like, on what actually happened at that moment when this particular thing, this wonderful thing happened to cause the image on the Shroud.
Yes. Well, there's evidence when you look at the image on the Shroud that actually at the moment that the image formed, and this was pointed out by Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, and I was very surprised when I heard it, and I had never seen it until he explained the evidence, and then it appeared obvious from then on that actually at the moment the image formed, the body of the man of the Shroud wasn't actually lying flat on a slab. It was upright and vertical. And that implies to me, and upright and vertical, not standing, believe it or not, this is what the evidence suggests scientifically, that as though the body had been suspended in the air. Because the feet are pointing downwards and at different levels, and the hair isn't hanging behind him, it's down on his shoulders and so on. There's so much, and the muscles at the back aren't flattened. There's so much evidence that points to this. It's as though the amount of force, if you like, had been reduced at that moment, as though gravity was less, or the mass of the body was less. So now, for me, if you want to say that this is not coincidence, that the man of the Shroud happens to, all the evidence points to it having been Jesus of Nazareth, and you look at what this man taught and how he lived, I think, he summarized it himself as the most important thing of what he had to say was, love thy neighbor as thyself. Okay? True. So that implies that there is a kind of unity between that your neighbor is yourself. Now, this is something that goes back to what I was saying earlier. We don't have time to go into it in depth now, but there is evidence from what the various interpretations of quantum theory, and from people right from the foundations of quantum theory, like Erwin Schrödinger as well, that actually at a fundamental level that our being as sentient human beings comes from a singularity of oneness together originally, and that somehow we have become separate, we've become restricted, we've become less than our full potential. And what he showed, what this man Jesus of Nazareth showed with what he taught and how he lived, is the way to fulfill that full potential by not limiting yourself to yourself, but by empathy expanding your potential to include the possibility to learn from everyone and to share with everyone. And so in doing that, if the force that makes solidity, if you like, substance of matter, is a result of the separation that comes out of our restriction, he showed how one could have a mind that was free, this idea of metanoia, to change the mind, to not be restricted, and to be able to unite rather than dividing through selfishness and so on. that in doing that, if you do it consistently and completely, as perhaps he did, that maybe the very atoms of your body begin to unwind. And as Professor David Bohm once put it, it's as though matter is frozen light. That's what the equations suggest. And well, what perhaps Jesus of Nazareth did is he unfroze that light, and it shone, and that's how the image formed.
So let me ask you, the both of you, this from an anatomical perspective. And again, this relates back to Jesus, of Nazareth being a normal human man or something different. There were two studies, one done in 1983 and one done in 2010, separately, obviously, stating that the proportions of the image on the shroud were not realistic.
That's been looked at in great detail by various forensic people, including a good paper by Giulio Fanti, who based on the studies with a mannequin, and also the measurements have been checked by Gilbert Lavoie with the hands and so on, and actually. It is in good proportion and what you would expect anatomically, but you have to take into account the fact that there was some curvature of the body, that it wasn't all. For example, the knees were bent slightly and so on. And so once you take all of that into consideration and you look at the three-dimensional image, it's basically it's anatomically. You can't fault it. You can't find a flaw there anatomically.
Now, was the Shroud of Turin originally brought to Europe? Now, was it brought to Europe by the Knights Templar? Is that something that's established and accepted, or is that just supposition?
No, that hasn't been established. There was some suggestion that may have been the case, but it's not known for sure. There are various different theories about where it was, but there is quite a lot of evidence that it was in Constantinople, and before that in Edessa, which is now called Sanliurfa in Turkey, and there are various historians who have done good work on sort of studying the previous history of the Shroud. If people want to know more about it, the one I would suggest is to look at the work of Professor Dan Scavone and also Ian Wilson, the historian who has written books about the Shroud.
Interesting.
But it's not really conclusive at all that it was owned by the Templars.
And in the
but in fact,
go ahead. Go ahead, Nigel.
Anthony, I was just about to say, the wonderful thing, though, is that we have this wondrous thing, and that we can now look at it, and hopefully we're men of goodwill, and that's the hard one, men of goodwill. Men of goodwill for all nations, all colors of faith or whatever, come to this and try to see through its what it conveys, that we have a size as human beings that is larger than our universe and much greater than dreams. If you see what I don't get poetic about this, but it really is something for the future of those little ones that look at us from a new growing perspective in our world and so on. There's something else though, if you would forgive me, Anthony, I'd like to take you into, and that is this incredible thing about this individual they call Jesus Christ, and I think this whole discussion is really apposite in terms of Easter and so on. Now, look, I am not a religious person. Somebody, as I said, I think I said in my interview with you, somebody splashed some water on me some years when I didn't know any better, and they called me a Catholic, but I am no Catholic in any practical sense whatsoever. I really am allergic to organized religion, but I do actually pay great recognizance to the great teachers and the way they actually taught their pure ethic, and not what came after that in terms of distortion, mangling of their wonderful statements and so forth. to suit short-term purpose, so to speak,
Sure.
Of any convenient vehicle that wanted to praise the Lord and get the money passed on to them, so to speak, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And that is no way for any of us to understand, as Andrew is trying to show us, the extraordinary nature of natural human beingness. And my great thing is that against the synthetic thing that we are trying to make happen now in the interest, so to speak, of the improvement of humanity. And I think this is a travesty of the truth, and people, I'm afraid, are going to buy into it. Now, just one other little thing, and I hope this is not digressing, but it's very important to say this. We were talking about the other routes, the Gnostic route, and all of that, all where the information actually comes from. All the real sources were thrown out by the early Christian church, and they kind of made a turgid extrapolation of it, and they call that the New Testament, if you see what I'm trying to say. Yeah. But there was a lot more to other epistles, other gospels, and so on of the apostles. There's Thomas, there's Philip, there's Bartholomew, all these kinds of things, and a lot of it's hidden within the Vatican vaults and so on. I think the great perpetrator of the greatest crime of all actually lurks in that place. I'm sorry to say this, but I find, as a Catholic, I find that really untenable. The kind of direction that this being so-called church took after the mangling that this wonderful individual went through. And just one other thing, to try to connect this up to maybe an extra dimension, extraterrestrial dimension. In the catalogue of accounts that actually expose all of this, there is a part in the New Testament where it describes the devil, and I quote this: "The devil taketh him up into an exceedingly high mountain, and showeth him all the cities of the world and the glory of them."
Interesting.
Now, I have been to Jerusalem, and I have been to the surrounding hills of Judea, and let me tell you, there ain't an exceedingly high mountain high enough where anyone can see the cities of anything except Jerusalem, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Yes. Oh.
And that is really a curious kind of thing to say.
Yes.
So I was looking for why such a thing would be said. So I looked around topographically, and I really couldn't find anything here. And then I made reference to a map of the world. If you take the globe and you stretch it out two-dimensionally, shall we say, and just include the land mass of the world in a picture form in front of you, shall we say. If you look at it, say Alaska on the left and the Soviet Kamchatka on the right extremes, and you take that all the way down to Australia and so on, South America, whatever, and you look at that landmass, the center would be Jerusalem, almost, okay?
Wow.
Very, very center. Now, if you really wanted to show anyone the cities of the world, you don't take them to a high mountain there. You take them just about 50 k's up, straight above the ground.
Exactly.
And you will see all the cities of the world. Now, the intimation here is obvious,
Good
is
point.
that this chap was taken up into space.
Wow.
And, of course, when he went up there, this whole business, I shall give you all of this, whoever this guy was obviously seemed to have authority to give him all of this.
Sure.
And in the end, it kind of ends with the scenario where Christ says, "Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written that thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and only him that shalt thou serve." I think he was chiding this machine being that I believe it was, who actually held this power, right, with their kind of, basic technology and all the rest of it, and said to him, put him in his place, and said, "Listen, mate, you're little more than a vacuum cleaner." They had them in those days. You really are a machine, or less than an insect in being so.
Sure.
So don't try and give me anything that I, as a living being, don't already have.
Hey, Nigel, I have a question I would like to ask the two of you. With the election of the new pope just occurring, a lot of people were, I was having discussions with a lot of people, and we were looking at the signs, and we found them to be quite interesting. There was the final conclave, which was of interest in itself, because on average it takes 7.5 voting cycles, whereas as opposed to this time it was only 5. And it was strange that Pope Benedict had amended the Constitution to the Vatican to allow the voting to begin 3 days earlier than normal, than normally would have taken. And why was that strange? It's because it's almost as if he assured that the earliest possible date for a vote to occur, which nobody would have agreed it would have happened on the fifth time anyway, was on 3/13/13, or from the Europeans' perspective, 13/3/13. And those numbers have a lot of significance, because when you take a look at Revelations 13:13, it reads, "And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men." Now this is said of the second beast, the false prophet. There were other signs too. Give me one moment here, guys. I had to cough. Sorry, I'll edit that out. The Pope Benedict, during the Angelus prayer, which was his last blessing and prayer to the congregation there, a seagull viciously attacked the dove that he had released. And then and a lot of people saw that as a sign, because the dove, being representative of peace, and a seagull symbolically representing freedom or a messenger. So there was some strange, symbolism occurring there. Also, Benedict being the first pope to step down in 600 years, the day of the announcement, lightning struck the Vatican, the Basilica.
Absolutely. Bringing down fire. Now, look, there are an awful lot of things that can be correlated. And, the whole point about my thesis is that, yes, it's just, if it's a thesis, it's an interesting one that people might be interested. But what if I'm right about the speculations I make on the evidence that I've found? What do we do as a kind of species in order to tackle something that can go past the Einsteinian forbiddance of equals MC squared and get here? And from all evidence that I have seen, have been here for so many thousands of years.
Nigel, I hate to interrupt you, but I got to ask you this. On the 12th, which was the day before the election of the Pope, which was on the fifth vote, which was unprecedented, that almost I don't think it's ever happened that early, was the Pan-STARRS comet. There was this massive comet that made its most brightest appearance. Yeah. So there's the prophecies of Saint Malachi, and everybody was making reference to, the Black Pope, Peter Romanus. And I think that there was a major misinterpretation of what Malachi was saying. People were thinking it was Peter Turkson. He was a physically a black man from Africa. I think it was totally misinterpreted. What Malachi was saying in his prophecy was that this would be the first ever Jesuit Pope. Because if you look at the Jesuits historically, they are the only group within Catholicism that does what? They wear black Cossacks robes.
Indeed they do, yes. Yes. I know them very well because I was educated by them.
So St. Malachi... Are you in agreement? Are you in agreement then with Malachi?
No. They had obviously two popes in terms of the Jesuits having one and the conventional church having two. The Jesuits were rebels, and they always were a thorn in the flesh of the conventional church, because they were scientists. They had multiple degrees. They were teachers. They were, if you like, the soldiers of Christ. They like to be called the soldiers of Christ, whatever. Well, I'm not an apologist for any religious faction, whatever. But it's a very interesting thing. That if you can go to extreme lengths. For instance, I had somebody say the other day that the chap's name was Bergoglio. Now, the word G-O-G strikes you immediately when you see the name. And if you want to do any research on the internet, you can take that really far by looking at the things about Gog and Magog. And here you would Gog and Magog. Just have a look, and you will see all kinds of.
I know. I saw the one where this Berg. They were saying Bilderberg and some other things.
So he's got Berg, Gog, Leo. So Gog and Magog were supposed to be all kinds of signs of evil and whatever. And really, it's easy, Anthony, to take oneself into into this kind of speculative land.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to see patterns in things. Actually, the Dr. De Lazare Barrow, who I was quoting earlier, with regard to what he said about the Shroud, has done research on the human mind capacity to see things, to see patterns that aren't there, because we're always looking for faces in clouds and things like that, and it's like that. You can see these letters and imagine the significances in patterns and so on. But yeah, well, as I say, the tree is known by its fruit. We'll have to see what he does and how he acts before we know what he's like.
The problem with the tree and fruit is that by the time you eat it, you bought it. So.
And one final question for the two of you, because this was just released a day or two ago. There was a newly deciphered Egyptian text, part of the Gnostic writings. I believe it was the crucifixion of Jesus story. It was talking to Pontius Pilate, and essentially what the experts are saying is that through this writing, there's evidence of a shape-shifting Jesus, being described. And are either of you familiar with that? It made major headlines here in the United States.
Yeah, well,
I wasn't very convinced.
I don't think you can shift shape in more significant a way than having so-called dead atoms blast 38,000 billion watts into a piece of cloth. Now, that is some shifting of shape, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely.
So, obviously, you could take these things to a ludicrous extent, really. But there's another simple thing I'll talk to you. I know you are an expert on Gnostic things and so on. I'll just quote you something here. There are numerous accounts, within the kind of Gnostic or Coptic Gnostic library, as they call it,
sure,
in which Jesus carefully explains to his apostles, that exactly how we must deal with alien beings should they be faced with them. Isn't it strange?
Wow.
And that the Coptics have this particular thing. And it says here, most notably of these explanations is that given in the first apocalypse of James. And that's in the Nag Hammadi Codex, if you'd like the reference there. Mm-hmm. In this text, Jesus explains to the Apostle James how to cope with these beings who take away souls by theft.
The archons.
What better description of abduction could there be in that, if you see what I'm trying to say? Wow. And you know how many, there are millions, it seems, that go through this and suffer through this. My take on that is that they are very special beings, that if there is an alien quantum here trying to convert humankind into their facility, so to speak, that the people they have to abduct and check up are the ones they can't do it to. So they are relatively safe, even though they go through these draconian experiences. It may be there are special people that can resist this plague, and inasmuch as that is so, they are a blessing unto themselves, so to speak. So Jesus goes on to, if I may just finish, Anthony.
Sure.
Jesus goes on to tell James, when he also says to you, where will you go? You are to say to him, here I quote, to the place from which I have come, there shall I return. And if you say these things, you will escape their attacks. Thus, if James makes it clear that his own route of being, in a sense, is saying, if James makes clear his own route, so to speak, in all this being to these creatures, that he shows them he fully intends to return to the natural route from which James himself comes as a human being, and that no distortions or no alterations into his entire being will be allowed by his will to happen in terms of how these things with their technology can act against human beings. And I think that's the greatest message we can give the world. Resist this technological sweep that's going to come and claim that they're going to do wonders in your body and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. Because I tell you what, the end of that rainbow might be the taking away of your eternal scope as a natural being.
Well, gentlemen, with that, we are up against the hour. We truly do live in a wondrous and mysterious world, and I would like to thank Dr. Andrew Silverman and Nigel Kerner for being with us this evening. It was a wonderful show. I'm very excited for the audience to have the opportunity to hear from two very intelligent men. So thank you both. And Dr. Silverman's website is lightoftheshroud.com, and Nigel Kerner's website is nigelkerner.com. And those links will be posted at Sceptre Radio Network as part of the information to go along with this show, which will remain there throughout history. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you for joining us for more original Sceptre Radio programming, where listening uncovers the world that's been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.